Okay, thank you for letting us make that transition, and thank you mostly for inviting me to this incredible space. You know, it wasn't part of my talk, but I think it's really interesting, the space that we were in, that we are in. This is a place where obviously people gathered as a community and had physical presence together. I think that has a lot to do with what I'm about to say today. I also have to say that I'm quite nervous, and the reason that I'm nervous is that when I'm speaking to performing artists or people who work in that field, I feel very comfortable because that's the field that I work in. This for me is a little bit of a stretch, and I had to even ask myself the question, or ask Sarah, why have you invited me? But hopefully I can give you some reflections on the way that we work when we make performance, because I think that these processes and these ways of working can inform the way that you're thinking about the work that you're doing. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about today has to do with how I work in a theater with collaborators, but I think again that can give us some interesting models. But let's start at the very beginning. Let's just think about the power of connection. There are very few things that I would stand up here and say are a constant or are universally true, but this is one of them. The singular constant that I believe exists is the fact that every human being wants to connect with another human being. I really think that that's true. And, you know, in the world in which we work and in which we experience, social media is based on this premise. Facebook, everything we can think about in that world, it wouldn't exist if that primal desire wasn't there. And it's also interesting to think about the fact that many of those systems actually promote a kind of fear, a fear of the virtual death if you were to leave those platforms. There was an interesting project several years ago which you may not have heard about because Facebook shut it down in one day, called the Social Suicide Project, where there was a diagram that looked like the revolver of a gun, and in one of the chambers was the Facebook logo, and you spun it, and if it hit the Facebook logo, it deleted your Facebook account. It's interesting to think about the fact that this is a kind of suicide, that you actually disappear in a certain way when this happens, yeah? So, but the main thing about connection is that it's very powerful, and it often starts with one person. A couple obvious examples are people like, let's say, Gandhi or Martin Luther King in America. These are people that start with a singular point, but they start speaking to people, and that sense of community expands and gets bigger and larger until it becomes something very powerful. And in the world of technology, or in the world of this world of the internet, obviously the Arab Spring is a time when we saw how that kind of power can be harnessed using things like the Twitter and Facebook and other communications channels. It actually was a channel that allowed that kind of powerful expansion to happen. And that's why we're here. We're here because we believe that the internet offers us those new channels and modes of connection. I believe that too. But the reason that I'm here is because I'm heavily invested in the notion that creating a compelling theatrical experience offers a particularly powerful form of human connection. So that's what I want to start with today, is to talk about how we make those pieces, and then we'll build from there. So the kind of collaborative process that we use in our media-intensive dance group, Troika Ranch, and that is used by numerous experimental theater groups around the world, like the Wooster Group, Pig Iron, the Rude Mechanicals, there's many others. They rely on a highly interactive process where each person, the choreographer, the composer, the dramaturgs, the dancers, the designers, everyone becomes an equal co-creator. Collaborations like these are neither easy nor practical for any number of reasons, but it is specifically because of those difficulties, because of the problems that ensue from all of that, that we actually choose to do it, because they allow us, I believe, to push us towards a higher level of creativity. For the purposes of this talk, I'm going to give it a name. I thought about this a little bit last night, and I don't know if it's a good name, but this is what we're going to call it. We're going to call these deep collaborations, yeah? Let's think about what that might mean. The main point is, what's the outcome? The outcome of a deep collaboration is a unified collective vision. All artists who work in this way, including Troika Ranch, champion the deeply held belief, and it's an old saying, the sum of the parts is greater than the whole. The thing I want to spend some time on is explaining why that happens, why that sum is greater than the whole. So the first thing is we need to think about, I guess, finding those people. I actually think that maybe whether you're working online or you're working in the real physical world, it's the same. You know, you're going to look for people that you know, people whose work you've heard about or admire. You know, this process is kind of maybe the same one way or the other. But the thing is, what we do that's a little bit different than maybe what you're doing in your projects is we rely on getting the people into the same room. When you create collaborative work for the stage, the general expectation is that you will be physically present. In more traditional theater, that's not always the case. Maybe the lighting designers don't come in until the end. Maybe the composer writes the music after the dance has been made, or vice versa. But when the kind of deep collaboration that I'm speaking of, everyone needs to be in the room. And once you've brought those people into the room, then you have to kind of develop some sort of structure. So let's see, I want to go through a few possibilities. I guess the first possibility is this one, which is anarchy. I don't know if that's really a useful one. I've never really tried it. Maybe there's some other theater groups that have done that. But probably you need some kind of structure at least to start thinking about this. But you know, when setting out to create a piece, the often case in the sort of traditional way of working, you're thinking about what I might call flying solo. Generally speaking, that's how writers or poets work. Composers also work this way, at least until the point that they have to take their music to the orchestra and it has to be played. We might visualize this working structure like that. That's flying solo. That's me in a room writing my music and doing it on my own, and I'm the only one feeding into that process. I'm reflecting on it and looking at it, but I'm the source of really everything. Now, another kind of structure with which we're all very familiar is a hierarchy. Yeah. Now, that's a very efficient structure for a lot of reasons. It's the structure that, for instance, Steve Jobs used to create Apple Computer, just to use one well-known example. In both of these cases, we still have this individual, but in this case, the individual has a chain of command where that information and the desire for what the outcome is flowing through the larger hierarchy. So that's really efficient, and it globalizes really well. If you want to spread things across different countries and work in different ways, structures like this, they're pretty good in terms of sustaining that kind of situation. But when we work, I might show you a different picture of what it looks like. It looks like a little bit more like that. Is anybody in the room a botanist? No botanists, okay. Well, I was going to ask you if you could identify what that kind of thing is. That's a rhizome. In this case, it's a fungus, that's growing, and you're seeing the whole structure of it, which most of it normally is underground. I'll give you the exact definition. A rhizome is a root-like subterranean stem, commonly horizontal in position, that usually produces roots below and sends shoots progressively from the upper surface. And this is the critical part. Notably, if a rhizome is separated into pieces, each piece can give rise to a new plant. So that's very different than that hierarchy. If you start breaking the chains in that diagram that we saw, things start to fall apart. But if you start cutting links in the rhizome, it still works. So that's also something we already know, and you know it too, just as well as I. This structure is already out there on the internet. We rely on it already in things like Flickr, Freesound, the Freesound Project, Newsbank, SoundCloud, Vimeo, all of these sources where people are contributing information. Maybe they're taking those materials and reshaping them and putting them back into the system. That's a rhizomatic collaborative process, and they empower individuals to share materials and move them around and do things with them. They echo that rhizomatic structure that you see before you because they abandon the hierarchy and they rely on those interconnected nodes. The thing is, when we're trying to be creative, when we're trying to have a powerful experience, we don't want to let the structure get in the way. Because the thing, when you're working creatively, you want to be as nimble and agile and fast and inventive as you possibly can. Hierarchic structures impede that process. They kind of hold you back from doing it. And, in our situation, we can let one person lead the group through a vocal exercise, and then someone else can take them through a guided movement improvisation, or we can do those things at the same time and look at them in the context to each other. It's incredibly free form. And then you can move from topic to topic, form to form, and let all of those elements inform each other. That's the kind of crazy process that we do when we make a work. So I'm sort of proposing, just at this point, to think about that rhizomatic structure as you're thinking about your projects. How can you take advantage of that notion that it's all completely interconnected but also interdependent, that you take one part off and a new plant can rise from that smaller portion? That's something I think worth keeping in mind. Okay, so we've gathered those people in the room. And who are those people and what are those people like? So I mentioned previously that the sum of the parts is greater than the whole. Again, a very old saying. In our time, and with both deep collaboration and the internet as a way of working, as a structure that allows us to work in mind, I'm going to rephrase that, and I'm going to say it like this. The sum of numerous interrelated parts will yield an outcome more complex than any one person can foresee. That's actually something, I don't know how many of you know about the notions of emergent systems. This is something that comes from science, but it's basically the notion that when you have, here, I'll give you an example. This is the way it was explained to me by a scientist who really gave it to me. He said, put a cup of coffee in your hand, and now zoom in down to the molecular level. What do you see? I said, I don't know, I guess I see some molecules or atoms. He said, well, if you go to the atomic level, you see a lot of atoms and they're doing like this, they're vibrating. That's what you see. Now he said, zoom back and imagine the coffee in your hand again. What do you experience? I said, it's warm. He said, that's right. That is the emergent property of those vibrating atoms. Together, when we look at them individually, they're doing this one thing that has a certain behavior that we observe. But when we look at it collectively, it changes into something else, or we perceive it in a different way. So that's the idea of that the complexity might be more than anyone can foresee. When we make a deep collaboration, we bring together numerous, passionate, individual voices to work together as equal co-creators. We seek collaborators that can work towards having a shared vision, but that have distinct passions and distinct ways of working. And crucially, each collaborator must feel free to say out loud what he or she cares about and to struggle to bring those elements into the mix. This arrangement, as I said before, it is not about efficiency or even order. It's about pushing each other further than we might go individually. That's why we put ourselves in the room together. Yeah? So given the complexity of human beings, it's very difficult to predict where what I would call the evolutionary pressures of that process, where they're going to go. And this is precisely why we choose to engage in deep collaboration, because you never know exactly what you're going to get, and that's actually the real power of working in this way. So there's another reason, though, that you bring those people into the room, because in fact, they offer you another opportunity. They offer you the possibility of beautiful constraints. I don't know if any of you are familiar with a film made by Lars von Trier. I think the date, I may have it wrong, but I think it's 2003. It's called The Five Obstructions. But I'm going to tell you about it for those of you who might not know it. If you haven't seen it, you must see it. It's a fantastic film about how we work and what constraints can do for us. So in this piece, Lars von Trier goes to his teacher, his mentor, from the Danish film school, who is a famous filmmaker in his own right, a guy called Jørgen Leth. And he asked him to make 5 versions of Leth's masterpiece, which is called The Perfect Human. But for each version, von Trier will specify a detailed list of obstructions or constraints that Leth must follow. I'm going to give a little away. I'm going to give you the first obstruction, and this is the list that von Trier gives to Jürgen Leth. The film must be shot in Cuba. Leth must answer the meaningless rhetorical questions he posed in the original film. Leth cannot build a set. And finally, no shot can be longer than 12 frames. That's 1/2 of a second. I actually tried to find a clip of Leth's reaction when he does this, but it is a combination of shock and exasperation when he says the 12 frames part. It's really, it's a great moment, and you see his face. And so Leth has to go out and observe these constraints. So I want to show you, sorry, I have to open another piece of software for this one. Hopefully it will behave. Okay. Yeah. I'm just going to show you a tiny bit of this. I guess you can.
Cuba. Havana. Singer.
Okay, I'd love to show you the whole thing. It's marvelous. It's really great, and it really works. And so, in the interest of time, I won't. But please do take a look at this movie, because the thing that you'll see in the movie is that, okay, they come back together, and now Leth shows von Trier the movie. And afterwards, von Trier is he's just so disappointed because he didn't actually cause Leth to fail, because this is really his goal. And there's a great line. Von Trier looks at Jürgen Leth and he says, the 12 frames, they were a gift, weren't they? And Leth looks back at him and goes, yes, a gift. And that is a wonderful, beautiful example of what constraint can do to us. When you're put into a situation where what seems like almost an impossible demand comes upon you, you have no choice but to think in a creative manner. And in terms of things like user interfaces and user experiences, everyone thinks about making it easy. Actually, I think you should think about making it hard, or making it difficult, or reframing the way you're touching this thing or experiencing it, because in fact, you're going to open a new door that you're not going to open any other way. I'm going to come back to that a little bit later, but I think that the notion of constraint is a really powerful thing that we can look at. So let me say it this way. Constraints serve to a fire that fuels creativity. Certainly, you can give yourself constraints as a solo creator, but when you collaborate deeply, the diverse voices and points of view of the co-creators are in play, ensuring that the whole group will have to deal with many unfamiliar constraints. You might hate the fact that you have to try it so-and-so's way, but as shown in the example of the 5 obstructions, it is when we are faced with difficult and, better yet, impossible constraints that things start to get really interesting. Okay, so now you can imagine maybe, there's a lot of you here, I'm sure you're all incredibly good at what you do. You have a passionate voice about what you do. You also have an ego. How do you put 5 or 6 or 8 of those people in a room and get them to work together? That's actually a little bit of a struggle, for sure. Some of you may remember it, I'm dating myself now, but years ago, 30 years ago or something, Michael Jackson spearheaded this project, We Are the World. They made a record that was to support the starving people in Ethiopia, and he brought all the American superstars together to make this record. And it was interesting, there's an apocryphal story that goes with that. Just above the door of the recording studio, where all the star musicians were passing through, was a sign. And that sign said, "Leave your ego at the door." Right? And so this is an interesting thing, because we need to speak passionately and directly about what it is that we care about, but we also have to manage the fact that our ego is in this mix somehow, and this can be really tricky. So one thing to remember is that when you collaborate, and this is again how it works with us in Troika Ranch, and I'm sure all the other groups I've mentioned, When you collaborate, the needs of the project come first. And actually, I didn't have this written down, but I want to jump in. Having moved to Germany, it's been really interesting to show my artwork there. Germans are very direct, and I was surprised by it at the end. They would walk up after a piece and say, I really, really hated your piece, and I want to tell you why. Now, I'm generalizing a little bit, but I actually had that experience, exactly those words. And I was like, ugh. But you know what? I am actually so grateful for that, because in fact, those people, at first I took it personally, and that's exactly what you cannot do in this situation. It's about the artwork. That's what I discovered. It's so deeply embedded in their culture that artistic practice and artistic art output is so important, it goes beyond people. It goes beyond me. That's a really good thing to remember, I think, when you're working in this way. So again, it's not a place for one person to dominate or to satisfy or to be seen as great. You are part of an ensemble where the talents of each individual shine brightest. Oh, my computer went blank. Sorry. Part of an ensemble where the talents of each individual shine brightest when they support and strengthen the goals of the project. Okay, so now we're back to Isadora. And what happens if you don't leave your ego at the door? Oh, sorry, that was supposed to be before. And then what happens if you don't leave your ego at the door? Your ego's going to get kicked in the ass. That's what's going to happen. There's a wonderful article on collaboration by a woman called Deborah Stein. And I want to read you the quote from this that she just captures this really, really beautifully. A dirty secret about collaboration is that a lot of people don't actually like it. They're not cut out for it. It's bad for your ego. Shit, it's bad for my ego. You have to simultaneously be very humble and very outspoken in your ideas. Sometimes you have to share an idea and insist that other people try your idea. People that you admire, people that you look up to, people that you think might be smarter and more talented and prettier than you. And then you have to be brave enough and clear enough regarding what you're looking for or what you're not looking for to say that you were wrong. It was a terrible idea. Let's try something else. Or maybe there was a glimmer, a phrase tossed off by an actor clowning with an imaginary martini glass, or even just the way she waved that glass around that points towards a style or a character or a scene. It's exhilarating, thrilling, challenging, and inspiring way to work. If you search HowlRound Stein collaboration, you will find this article. It's the top link. Please take a look at it. It's very, very good, and there's a lot more in it. So that's what we do. We bring ourselves together. We put ourselves in the same physical space. We bring together really talented people with very passionate ideas about how work is going to be made, and then we have to deal with each other. And so really, to say it, in the sort of shortest possible way, collaboration is for the fights. That's why we come together. We come together to really struggle and fight for the things we believe in. The reason that you've invited those strong-willed and talented people into the room is precisely because they do not share your point of view. Not because they think like you, and this is another problem of the internet. Things like Facebook, you're actually seeing a lot of people that think like you. That's a problem that we have to think about. It's important. And so in our practice, we bring together people who don't think the same way. And of course, there's going to be disagreements and friction, even maybe like some big outbursts, but that's why we do it. The constants imposed by the passions, skill sets, and knowledge of your collaborators means that you're going to create something that you don't expect, that outcome that you cannot foresee is going to happen. And you just have to keep saying to yourself, it's not personal, it's about the work. When did I start? 2 o'clock? Okay. I want to stay within my time limit. All right. So that's how we work. That's how we're working together. And I just wanted to let you in on that. Again, I think that maybe it will serve as some inspiration, but it's a very different way than we would work on the internet. So now I want to change off here a little bit and look at how new technologies come about and how we kind of bring them in, because I think it helps us understand what we're doing now. But I'm going to use some older examples to look at that. So part 2 is called You Are, or maybe it's Aren't, there. Let's see. So, if you look back in history, it's not always the case, but it's often the case, that as each new technology appears, there's a group of people that start experimenting with it to see what it can do. And during those times, they often focus on the technology itself. On a personal story, that's how I began getting in this field. When I was a student as an undergraduate at California Institute of the Arts, working with my longtime partner in crime, Don Stoppiello, who's the choreographer and co-founder of Troika Ranch, I invented this device called a MIDI dancer. I bought some radio-controlled cars at a toy store, I tore them apart and turned them somehow into a device that could measure the flexion of the joints and make music with that, so that a dancer's movement could directly generate the music for a piece, right? Kind of a hackathon of my own. So that's how I started. And then at first, and the first piece, I wouldn't want to show you the first piece we made with it because it wasn't that great as a piece. It was a really interesting expose of what this technology could do. And that's the process that happens over and over. But you can go back a lot further. So probably a lot of you have heard the story about the Lumiere brothers, the early days of cinema. There's this apocryphal story about how there's a train being projected in front of an audience like this in the theater, and they see the train coming toward them, and they run from the theater. I'm going to actually read you what it said in Der Spiegel about this. One short film had a particularly lasting impact. Yes, it caused fear, terror, even panic. It was the film L'arrivée d'un train en gare de la Ceuta. I'm sorry, my French isn't very good. Although the cinematographic train was dashing towards the crowded audience in flickering black and white, not in natural colors and natural dimensions, and although the only sound accompanying it was a monotonous clatter of the projector's sprockets engaging in the film's perforation, the spectators felt physically threatened and panicked. It's hard. We can't even imagine that happening to us. You know, put yourself in that situation, a black and white train and no sound and just the of the projector. You can't even imagine that moment. But it's because of when it happened, right? I also want to throw in that in my research for this, I found out something. It's actually, there's some debate about whether this ever happened, but there is a strong thread that leads to the idea that, in fact, the Lumiere brothers had developed a way of doing 3D projection at that same time, at the turn of the century, or 1895. And there is some suspicion that what those people saw, the story, was they saw a 3D projection of a train, not just a normal projection. I thought that was really an interesting side note there. But the main point of what I'm getting at, regardless, is that in that time, that very minimal experience was what we would now call immersive. It was absolutely immersive because it was so far beyond the previous experience of anyone in the room that as far as they were concerned, that train was real. It's really something to keep in mind, and I want to come back to it a couple more times. But let's go on. Here's another example. Again, I can just do this one quickly. I think everyone's pretty aware of this story, maybe. In the 1930s, Orson Welles did his broadcast of War of the Worlds. And one thing, we know this, it's like the whole country thought that we were being invaded by Martians for real, right? The thing I thought about this was interesting. I think it might be, I don't know, maybe some of you can correct me on this, but it might be the first time that media went viral. Because in fact, people were knocking on their neighbors' doors and calling each other on the phone to warn them to go hide because the Martians were coming to destroy them. Right? As best it could within that situation, War of the Worlds was actually a viral event. And of course, the main reason it worked was there was the thing at the beginning where they gave a bulletin, a news bulletin, they put it in the context of news, and that's why it seemed to be real, right? But there was also the fact that it was an unfamiliar medium. It was new in a way. It was still relatively new in that time. And to give you one final example of this, a slightly different thing, and I did it partially because it gives me the actual phrase I really want to use. In this early 1960s, there was a popular American television program called You Are There. It was built upon the sense of immediacy that was provoked by War of the Worlds, in fact. Let me just show you. It's easiest if I... oh, sorry, I had the quote there. So let me just show you a short clip to give you a sense of what this was like. Sorry, we didn't plug the sound in.
The Chicago Fire. You are there. Walter Cronkite reporting, Sunday, October 8th, 1871. In this year and month, we are suffering in Chicago a strange calamity that is most devastating and annoying to that new city, which is now only 30 years old. In this year, 1871, Chicago has grown like a boomtown, and a series of fires the last few months has made the city fathers realize that their city has grown much too fast. Chicago is now going through a drought.
Okay, so the format of this is that Walter Cronkite, who was, by the time he left that being the anchor of the CBS Evening News, was the most trusted man in America, according to polls, presented this event from 1871 as if it was happening in this moment, and all the tools of news-gathering media were there and could show us how it was happening. Again, another attempt to kind of evoke this notion of immediacy, this notion of immersiveness, this notion that it's really happening right in front of us right now, using media as a tool. Considering what television has become, it's pretty incredible. I mean, this is experimental work, in my view, right? So, all of these attempts, and you can find more, a new technology comes, they don't know quite what it means yet, and they start playing around to see what happens. Yeah? That's a very useful process, and it's a little annoying because for a time, things tend to focus really on just the gear, or the sort of whiz-bang of it, this kind of stuff. But it's natural, actually, and it fades out eventually. Because, for instance, in cinema, while you have the Lumiere brothers having that train coming towards you at the beginning, soon you have Eisenstein creating his masterpieces and thinking about editing, and a whole new language of cinema emerges, right? That's the natural process of introducing and showing a new technology. So, obviously, what we just saw was from what we would now call immersive, and I'm sure even the audience in that time didn't believe they were watching the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. But this reframing of history within the context of live programming added a sense of immediacy and presence that the standard documentary format could not offer. But the problem with all this is, it can't last forever because you aren't actually there. As experiences like these become familiar, our experience informs the brain that the train is not real, that the Martians are not really coming, and that you are not really watching the Chicago Fire. Still, all of these examples point out that the consideration of new possibilities and forms, as I said, happens at the moment a new technology appears. So, there's some historical examples of how this happens, right? I'm looking way into the past. But let's come up to date now. All of you heard of the Gartner hype cycle? I'm really fond of this, and it doesn't look very good on the screen. It's a little hard to read the curve there with the lights. So you start with the technology trigger. I love these terms, they're really good. Then you get to the peak of inflated expectations, and then you fall drastically into the trough of disillusionment, and gradually from there you move up the slope of enlightenment until you get to the plateau of productivity. Oh, thanks. Yeah, so there we go. Wow, lasers. That's awesome. Okay. Yeah, so it goes up. There we go. Thank you very much. That was fantastic. This is actually a very useful graph, and if you go to the Gartner site, they take technologies that they're following and they plot them on this curve. It's super interesting to look at because they're very smart about it, because they're also trying to guide investors and things like that, so they're thinking about it very seriously. But the thing I want to ask, because probably the thing that we're heading towards, probably the thing that's going to be the next big way of interacting with material that we're all going to experience, which is virtual reality. Where are we, do you think, on that curve? I'm going to let you answer that question yourself. But I don't think that we're at the plateau of productivity yet. I'll say that much. And even you can think about, let's take it another step further. Imagine the kind of deep collaboration I'm talking about. Where do you think we are with that along that curve? Yeah? There's a lot of elements missing for me still in terms of what the internet gives us. So let's keep this in mind. that there is always this curve and that we're moving through it. And our goal is to get to the plateau of productivity. That's where it's so seamless that you don't have to think about it anymore. Where it's so part of our culture and so part of our experience, you don't have to explain that when the dancer moves her arms like this, music is going to come out, which is what we had to do at the beginning. That's our goal. That's the place that we're headed. Okay, so we have this opportunity whenever a new technology comes to explore it, to play with it. That's where you are. That's where you are, yeah? And so it's good that you play with it, but we have to aim for the plateau of productivity, the seamlessness, yeah? Okay, final part. I hope I'm saying this word right. The skeuomorphism of connection. The word skeuomorphism, if you don't know it, you're already very familiar with it. The trash can that's on your desktop on your computer is a skeuomorph of a real trash can. It looks like it, and you sort of have this feeling that maybe it shares properties with it, but actually it's nothing like it. You know, one of the great things that I can do here, I can have the satisfaction of, like, I should have done this with every page in my speech, I can do like this and have the satisfaction of putting it in that trash can. And I see it over there, and there's an accumulating bundle of paper letting me know that I've made it through the speech, right? There's these great properties about it. And actually, if I need it, I can go take it out again. But you know what? Even just the sound of the way that you touch it, that's actually important. It's not the same as that little icon on your desktop. So skeuomorphism has come under a lot of criticism lately, and this is why it was a big deal when Windows 8 came out, because Microsoft really rejected that idea and really embraced this notion of going almost what seemed retro in this very clean design. But the thing that I'm concerned about is that I think that there is a skeuomorphism of connection between people. Facebook is not a real connection to other people. It is a kind of connection. It allows you to communicate. It allows you to have some sense that each other are there. But maybe I'm old-fashioned, but I would argue that's not as the same as having a really dear friend who, actually, my definition of a dear friend is someone I can call if I'm in jail to get me out of jail. Yeah? How many of your Facebook friends can you do that with? Apply that test to your list. You'll see that the number is much smaller than the number you have on that page. Yeah? So this really concerns me, the fact that, in fact, the notion of connection to other human beings is like that trash can icon. We have this representation of it. People are trying to tell us that it's real, but it's not real. And that is something you really have to pay attention to, because if you want to have deep collaboration, you need to be together. You need to have people that you can rely on. You need to be able to sense their presence. Now, let me hit some points about this, some that you can think about, because these are the kinds of things. I'm not going to make a lot of suggestions today, but if I'm going to make some suggestions about where you can go, these are some of them. The first problem is it's not seamless. It's very simple. Here the technology simply hasn't been able to meet the required need. Anything that impedes seamlessness, anything that impedes a seamless, improvisational, and rich communication between us is antithetical to deep collaboration. Yeah? Low frame rates, glitchiness, stuff going wrong like that. I mean, I've done lots of stuff in Oculus Rift. I put it on. Yes, it's amazing, and it's cool that you can look around and see everything. It's low resolution. The frame rates often aren't very good. It's nothing like reality. Yeah? We're heading that way. That's always our goal, but it's not yet there. And again, as I pointed out with my piece of paper here, it lacks physicality. That's actually important. I mean, yes, we can obviously experience things on the internet. There's lots of successful models for doing that. And I don't mean to be reactionary in saying this, but in fact, to touch things and hold them in your hand is a property that we need to remember is important. There's actually usefulness in that. I'm not saying that the other stuff isn't, but that's one important property. And here's a thing that's really hard to define, but in fact, these kinds of communication systems, I'm sorry, Google Hangouts, the people on there, I can see them, I can hear what they're saying, we can communicate, but I don't really think that they are present in the way that I would think of the word presence, especially when I think about people on stage and performers working together. On its face, this whole idea is more ethereal, but the fact that probably what we mean by presence is the ability to read the body language and the other cues we can observe when the presence of the entire physical body of the person can be seen. I've been asking a question in my lectures about dance and media lately because I'm very interested in working still with interactivity and dance. And my question is, what is the bandwidth of a human body? Think about that question. These sensors that I'm talking about that lots of people have used, it is like the tiniest micro reduction of everything that's happening with the dancer's body. How do you capture that whole message? How do you capture everything that's going on and communicate that to another person? The body, the physical body, and that sense of presence is really important. And maybe related to that, or even the same, but important also, and this has been a big concern of mine lately, these systems impede empathy. When the presence of the other person is not felt, another crucial ability is impaired, the ability to empathize with the other person. As I was just saying, millions of subtle clues about the other person's state of being are being transmitted to us every second, clues that are critical to effective collaboration. This ability is critical when it comes to the fights that I talked about. It's all about the fights. How many of you, and I bet you it's a lot, have had an email back and forth go awry? I'm talking about that time when an innocuous comment or a small criticism is misconstrued by either you or the other person, and the situation escalates into the text-based equivalent of a screaming match. It happens because there's so much missing in that email. There's so much. This is why we need to use emote icons. I use smiley faces a million times a day to try and indicate that I'm really making a joke, right? There's just so much missing. So that's really important, this sense of empathy, and I think it's actually a very serious problem, and I see it when I see people interacting on the internet, the kinds of comments and the name calling and the bullying that happens in comment chats that go back and forth on the internet, especially on political topics in the United States. I think it's a very big concern, because the distance and the fact that we cannot empathize, that we can't look into that person's eyes and feel them, that's a big problem, and that's something to think about for you as well. So, I'm getting to the end. So basically, there's something lost and there's something gained in all of this. We've made many of our materials digital because doing so offers us new possibilities. But up till now, a great deal of that invention is based far more on efficiency than it is on creativity. For example, 3D printers offer us incredible new shapes and volumes, some that stagger the imagination. But they also take the sculptor's hands away from the clay. Another example, when it comes to language, we must type the individual characters that make up words more naturally formed by the voice. Because we can cut, copy, and paste, which was doing frequently as I did this talk and prepared for it, a new fluidity comes to the organization and layout of the words. But the fact is, we're actually going through a relatively tedious act of digitizing speech, something far more suitably and efficiently expressed with our vocal cords. So there's lots of instances where this stuff is really getting in the way, and we don't even think about it sometimes. Typing emails is so natural, but really just talking to someone is really efficient and actually tells a lot more, right? So I was going to show you some of Troika Ranch's recent piece, but I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to kind of come to the end. So to close out give my summary here, until we can consistently and with the highest possible fidelity represent the richness of experiencing multiple people working together in the same room, it will not be possible to realize a deep collaboration on the internet. The technology you hold in your hands has empowered an entirely new means of working together, even when large distances separate people. But these technologies do not offer the required level of communication, presence, and physicality that one requires to generate a deeply interactive and powerful collaboration. In a perfect digital world, and this is your goal, this is what I'm saying I would encourage you to think about and head towards this. In a perfect digital world, we will keep the advantages that digitization has brought us, but we will also continuously seek new ways to regain the physicality, presence, and all the other elements that I mentioned before that we've left behind. If we can reach that goal, if you can really be present, if you can touch this stuff and move it and be in it and really feel like you can see what someone else is feeling, not just what they're saying, what are they feeling? If you can do that, then I think you're going to open a door of online sharing and collaboration that will absolutely stagger the imagination. And this is my final offering to you. I'm not taking the time to show my piece, but in the last piece that Troika Ranch made, the audience is on stage with the performers. We've invited the audience to be part of that collaboration. Now it's not just the people that design the piece, it's the audience coming together. If I was to audition I'm going to audition all of you for Swarm. And this is the thing I'd like you to do, and it's not very easy, and this is my last little experiment. I'd like you all to find a partner if you can, just someone sitting next to you, if you have to turn behind you, whatever. But if you can just find each of you one other person, do that quickly, look around, find someone that's near you that you can see. And I would like you to sit there, and I would like you to, I'm going to time it, I want you to look into their eyes for 20 seconds. So find that person and really look at them and hold their gaze for 20 seconds. Ready, go. Okay, that was 20 seconds. If you, in your projects, can duplicate the intensity of that experience, you will have succeeded. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very intensive talk and experience. Yeah. We have plenty of time for questions. We actually have time if you're really keen to show.
Well, I guess I can just show you. We just finished this residency a couple weeks ago. I don't even have video actually to show yet, but I did have some photos. So let's see if I can call those up. So just to let you see. So in this version of the piece, because of the size of the stage, there were 35 people, or between 35 to 40 people that were invited into the performance. And so there were 6 performers, and they were trained, and it was a very interesting process because, in fact, you cannot rehearse this piece. You can only prepare the performers to be ready for the things that might happen when that audience enters the stage. So there was a structure, and they had notions about that structure and how it could go. But in fact, the actions of the audience would change everything, because sometimes the audience would be standing in the place you were supposed to be performing, and then you had to adjust that. And there were also certain kinds of actions that if they saw them in the audience, they would change their behavior. For instance, if they saw the audience imitating one of their movements, they would come to that audience member and invite them into the light and say, "Show me." So that as the piece went on, and also I guess the other element I should tell you about is that there's a kind of little performance of its own that happens in the lobby before the piece starts. Every member of the audience is spoken to, and I won't describe the whole process, but there's a little one-on-one interaction with every single member of the audience. And during that, one of the things we do is we ask them for their telephone number. And so we get that and we collect that for as many people that agree to do so, which was about 95% of the people. And during the piece, they start getting text messages, and it's done by groups. There's 6 different groups that are formed, so sometimes they get a group message, and they also get individual ones. But in the group messages, because what we were dealing with is, are you going to be present? Are you going to be here with us? The instructions in these text messages were always in the same form. They would say something like, find the performer that is nearest you and attempt to imitate the movement they are doing right now. Or write a text message to a friend describing what's happening in this piece at this moment. Or it would say something like, for the group, all of you walk around the central projection screens, we call it the hive. Walk around the central projection screens 3 times, or take a selfie and send it to a friend. So what the debate we were opening up is, are you going to be here with us, or are you going to go into your device? And it went both ways. You can see sometimes in some of these photos, you'll see that some people are looking at their phone because they're sending text messages, they're on Snapchat, they're doing all this kind of stuff during the piece. And what we saw was that kind of thing that we're all dealing with on stage live. And so, I mean, it was the first version. It was performed by students. We will next perform it with professionals. But the thing that we're mainly saying is that, you know, it's clear that we live in a time when every single one of us is an author. You know, I write Facebook status messages. I wrote one last night about how excited I was to be here at this conference, right? But I'm producing, I heard a great saying the other day, that Facebook is the largest media in the company in the world that actually produces no content itself, right? We all do it for Facebook. So we are all content producers, and so our feeling in terms of creating this piece, Swarm, was, all right, if we're in the time when we're all authors, then come on stage and co-author this piece for us. And it was really wonderful. Every night, every show that we did was really different. It was interesting that the first 5 minutes would kind of tell you a lot about what the outcome was going to be. But there were many unusual and fantastic moments, like this 6 screens in the center, one evening and one evening only, all 39 people gathered within that, and they all pointed at the sky like that at the same time. We didn't tell them to do that. It happened. That's that unforeseen outcome that can happen when the particles start influencing each other. So that's what was happening in Swarm. We were trying to open up that collaboration, bring the audience in, and I think that this is the kind of thing that, you know, I'm proposing you should be thinking about. How do you do that in the apps and the different things that you're making?
Thanks again. Thank you for this, also showing this last thing. I think one of the things that is so different with using technology nowadays as we are and how it happened in the past is that somehow nowadays we're much more aware of that our everyday content creation, let's say, is something that can be preserved for posterity. We know that the Internet Archive is there, whereas people who came to this church 400 years ago, they never really thought that what I'm doing here today will be exhibited to someone or will be preserved in some way or another, and can be seen by us 400 years later. So technology maybe has a role in all of this, but in a different way. But when it comes to connecting, I fully agree. We've all experienced those conference calls without video, and we know what mess that is. So, does anyone have a question? I can't really see very well the hands from here, but please raise a hand if you have a question. There's one, please.
I really enjoyed your diagram of botanist. I can remember studying. No, it's probably not really good advice. So anyway, I really enjoyed your, obviously showing work structures, whether hierarchical just you or kind of free flow that you work in. Within the context of European projects in general, they're very structured, and that's just the way they have to do it, it's the way they're funded, they're very structured. It's a lot of recording, it's a lot of communication, a lot of talking. And I wonder, what would you say as kind of a lobbyist for government? This is not how you catalyze creativity. No one is telling you what you know that he has to write a report about music for airports. It's just make music for airports, and that's deliverable into their kind of product. So.
See, now you start asking the really hard questions. Well, I don't know that I'm going to convince anyone. It's a problem that exists all over the place. It was interesting that I was invited to apply with a group of artists and scientists for a project last year, and the organization that was inviting us to propose these potential grants was much more of a science. Well, they were only a science organization. This was a real stretch out for them to work with artists. But the format in which we were brought together to meet each other was like a scientific paper gathering. And we tried to talk to them about the fact that, in fact, artists work in a different way, and we would present ourselves in a different way. And I think it's really difficult to convince people that this is important. The only thing maybe that works is to say, look at the internet itself. and look at how it works. I think there's enough models out there to show that in fact the way things are actually happening, the exciting things that are happening are because of that rhizomatic structure, those nodes that are interrelating and where the outcomes aren't really known. It's really hard for a funding organization, it's hard for them to accept the idea we don't actually know what's going to happen. But in fact, that's the best thing that they could offer you, is to be able to let you say that. So I don't know. I'm not sure that I have a really strong, powerful thing that I'm going to say that would convince a funding agency or these kinds of organizations to do this. I think it just takes time partially, but it also takes your voices collectively saying, look at this. It actually impedes us from doing our job well. I don't know what else to say besides that. I think so, but there's still, it's always tricky. One story, I'm a big fan of Salvador Dali. I know pretty much all of his paintings, but I finally got to go, I think it was at the Louvre that I first saw a group of his paintings, and one of the ones that I loved, I just in my imagination, it was always this big. Well, it's this big. That's a problem, that I didn't understand that somehow, right? So I think that while it's true, I was focusing on my experience as a creator, although I do feel very passionate about the notion that connecting people is very important. But I nevertheless, I think that you have to think about these things. And what I was trying to emphasize at the end there was that the notion of touching things, being physical with them, is really important. I think virtual reality offers a lot of help in this regard, because if you can be in a room and get that sense of scale because of a VR headset or some technology like that, that's super helpful, for instance, when it comes to visual art. But there's also that experience, and at least with some sculptors that I've seen, you're invited to touch those sculptures. Can we do that with a haptic feedback? Maybe. But these are the kinds of things, I think it's just about intensifying the experience on every level and thinking about, as I said, giving it the highest fidelity you can. It's funny, I think of like the old names for old records, high fidelity, right? But it's like to really give it that kind of fidelity. Even to the point, I was involved many years ago. I was invited by the New York City Public Library, the art portion of it, where they have all the films and all the stuff relating to the arts. And we were invited to think about this is a long time ago, so some of the things you think about now weren't even a possibility then. But I think it was interesting that even with that, one of the things they came up with was this wonderful term, the levels of blessedness, because they were talking about curation. How do we curate this stuff? And what they came up with was a kind of set of concentric circles in terms of how the artwork would be presented to the public. In the center were the top-notch curators that they already worked with, who say, this is an important piece of work and here's why. And then there were a next circle of what would be less, not such a strong expert, but someone who still deserved more respect than the general, well, not respect, but who knew more than the general public. But even then, the third circle was the general public. So that there was also even just this notion of what's popular. And it was an interesting idea that we could actually, again, use this visual art. It was visual art stuff, but through these levels of blessedness, we could both indicate and lead people towards something useful, but also connect the people to each other so that the fans who just love this work could get on and say, this piece is great and this is why I think so. That's a great thing to do. And so in the end, I still come back to this notion, it's about connecting people to each other. Because in fact, if you love Salvador Dali and I love Salvador Dali, I want to have a coffee with you. You know, I mean, I think that that's really at the bottom of everything. Any other questions? Yes.
Use it, do interesting things with it. But I suppose there's a, thank you, related to that is this idea of what preservation means. And, you know, we're all experiencing, and I remember last night the wonderful moment of, because we had something of the experience of the altar during the day, which was really interesting, this interactive kind of engagement with it. But it was only when we were here in the space and we all did this, you know, exactly what you're talking about. It was something about this presence. However, what I'm interested in, I think, in relation to your work, and if you have a view about this, is that we got a glimpse of your work, you showed us some stills from the work, but that's not what the work is. And I'm just wondering if you have a view about whether or not you think that your work and work that is similarly in this interactive space has a way of preserving itself, and if preservation is actually something you value or think is important for this work.
Yeah, it's a very difficult question. I mean, being that Dawn and I have been working with Troika Ranch for 25 years now, we start to think about, I mean, we have piles of old videos and things, and we start thinking about, oh yeah, do we want to try and hold on to this? Do we want to try and do something with it? Of course, it's a very inadequate way of representing what we did. I would like to meet whoever is working. I saw this thing about open and hybrid kinds of book publishing, right? That was one of the topics you mentioned. I'd like to meet those people because we're thinking about revisiting. I mean, we're not going to write a book about this, you know, but how can we take all of these materials that we have on hand and our words and everything and put this into a form that is really a compelling document that not only people in maybe, you know, in my general age group would read, but a 20-year-old would read. I mean, Sarah and I were just at a meeting the other day, and one of the things we're talking about in terms of digital work and all this is that, you know, what is the way to actually communicate? It's dangerous when you have some people that are, you know, heading towards at least middle age in the room, and that's all that's there, because you actually don't know how to properly communicate with those people. So, but to get back to your question, it's really hard to preserve performance work. And even the question of just like, it was also interesting, you know, it's funny, I don't know if they ever documented this process that they had at the New York City Public Library, because it was super interesting and I was privileged to be part of it. Just to give you an example, they showed us a bunch of different compression codecs, because one of the issues, if you're going to digitize film, what does it do to the image? Because in fact, it's so interesting, film is one of the best archival mediums around. You can be 100 years old and it's still fine. And actually digital stuff doesn't last that long. So there was a big topic about how do we hold on to this stuff, right? And also, because it's a great story and you talk about rights issues and things, they had a group of lawyers that were talking to them about how are they going to put this online? How are they going to deal with that problem? It's a massive problem, right? And I thought it was very interesting. 5 of the lawyers were like, well, basically, you can't really do this. You're not really going to get around it. But there were 2 kind of more radical ones. And they said, actually, it's your job as the New York Public Library, one of the most important libraries in the United States. It is your job to put this online and get sued and go to the Supreme Court and win. That's your job, actually, is to press this issue by putting that documentation out there so that the questions get legally answered. So I diverted from your question, but really what they were doing there, and this again, it has to be at least 10 years ago, was very forward thinking. And I should check to see if there's a published thing, because maybe you can share it with them. But the main point is, there is something important about what we do, and there's a lot of people doing it. Like I said, I mentioned some of the names, and there's plenty more. I don't know how to hold on to this. I mean, certainly a virtual reality experience would be better. It was interesting, Swarm, we figured we can't videotape this, so we just had a couple people put on GoPro cameras and go in and do the piece. They were audience members wearing GoPro cameras so that you were kind of in it. That's the documentation we made to try and sort of address that particular problem. I guess the answer is I don't have a good answer for it, except that yes, I do think it should be preserved. I mean, people like the Wooster Group, which is in a way more traditional theater, but people like Gob Squad and people like Rimini Protocol, I mean, there's lots of groups that are working in this way. This is really important stuff that needs to be held on to. It is the forefront of theatrical thinking at this time. We need to find a way to have it around. Yeah.
I think we're headed for coffee
Great.
now.
Perfect.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And the speakers also get thanked by the Ministry of Culture for their wonderful contribution.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks again.
Thanks.